The frost out here doesn't just kill the crops. It cracks the spirit. Gideon found her shivering in the dirt of his barn, a misplaced mail-order bride, with a ruined dress and nothing to lose. They didn't fall in love. They struck a deal, and they married before sunrise. The wind off the Colorado plains didn't blow. It scraped. It carried ice crystals that bit into exposed skin like ground glass. Gideon stood on the porch of his homestead, a dark silhouette against the whitewashed timber, and watched the horizon disappear into a bruised, violent purple. Winter was coming early. He pulled his sheepskin collar tight around his neck. His hands, thick with calluses and permanently stained with axle grease and soil, felt stiff. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 10 degrees, and the sun had just finished dying behind the ridge. He needed to check the barn. One of the draft horses had been favoring a hind leg, and the cold would only make the joint lock up tight. Gideon didn't want to go out. He wanted to sit by the cast-iron stove, drink coffee that tasted like burnt copper, and stare at the empty rocking chair until the exhaustion dragged him under. That was the routine. 3 years since cholera took Mary. 3 years of waking up to a house that echoed too loudly, working until his muscles failed, and sleeping a dreamless, heavy sleep. He grabbed the kerosene lantern, struck a match against the door frame, and adjusted the wick until a low orange glow pushed back the dark. He picked up his Winchester rifle from the corner by habit. Coyotes were getting bold with the cold snap, and desperate predators didn't care about fences. The walk to the barn was a 50-yard fight against a rising gale. By the time he shoved the heavy wooden doors open and slipped inside, his breath was coming in ragged white plumes. The barn smelled of dry hay, manure, and the warm, dusty scent of livestock. It was a good smell. Honest. He hung the lantern on a rusty nail and walked down the center aisle. The draft horse nickered, a low rumble of greeting. "I know Samson," Gideon muttered, his voice a low gravel that hadn't been used all day. He ran a hand down the animal's flank, feeling for heat in the injured leg. "I know." That was when he heard it. It wasn't a rat. Rats scuttled. This was a shift. A slow, heavy slide of hay from the empty calving stall in the back corner. Gideon froze. He dropped his hand from the horse. In one fluid motion born of frontier paranoia, he leveled the Winchester. The lever clicked down and up with a sharp metallic clack, chambering around. The sound echoed in the cavernous space. "Come out," Gideon said. His voice was flat. No anger, just a promise. "I won't ask twice. You come out, or I start putting holes in the dark." For a long second, nothing happened. Only the wind howling outside and the nervous shifting of the horses. Then the hay rustled again. A pile of loose alfalfa and a moth-eaten horse blanket he'd discarded last spring began to move. Gideon tightened his finger on the trigger. He expected a drifter, a rustler. He didn't expect a woman. She sat up slowly, clutching the filthy blanket to her chest. Her teeth were chattering so violently the sound was audible over the storm. She wore a woolen coat that was entirely inadequate for the territory, stained with mud around the hem. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark brown, clung to her pale, dirt-streaked face. She stared at the barrel of the rifle. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked from the gun up to Gideon's shadowed face. "If you're going to shoot," she managed to say, her voice shaking uncontrollably, "do it near the heart. I can't feel my hands anyway." Gideon stared. He slowly lowered the rifle, the barrel pointing at the dirt floor. He grabbed the lantern off the nail and walked closer, casting the light over her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, but exhaustion had carved deep lines around her eyes. Her lips were tinged blue. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nora," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter. "Nora Jane." "What in the hell are you doing in my barn, Nora Jane?" She let out a dry, rattling breath that might have been a laugh if she had the warmth for it. With a trembling hand, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded, heavily creased piece of paper. She held it out. Gideon didn't take it. He just looked at it, then back at her. "It's a contract," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I was supposed to be a bride for a man named Josiah Trent, town of Red Creek." Gideon frowned. Red Creek was 8 miles south. "Josiah Trent packed up and left for the Nevada silver mines 3 weeks ago. Owed money to the bank and half the saloon." Nora closed her eyes. The news didn't seem to shock her. It just confirmed a suspicion she had already made peace with. Her head fell back against the wooden slats of the stall. "The station master figured as much. I waited at the depot for 2 days. When my money ran out, the proprietor of the boarding house suggested I could pay my way on my back." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a startling, fierce clarity. "I started walking. Guess I got turned around. Found this barn when the sun went down." Gideon processed the information. He looked at her shivering frame. Hypothermia was setting in. In another 2 hours she would have fallen asleep and never woken up. He felt a familiar heavy exhaustion settle in his chest. He didn't want this. He didn't want another human being's survival resting on his shoulders. He was barely carrying his own weight. But he wasn't a murderer. And leaving her in the dirt was murder. "Get up," he said. She tried. She pushed against the floorboards, but her legs gave out. She collapsed back into the hay with a quiet gasp. Gideon sighed. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, set the lantern down, and reached into the stall. He grabbed her by the upper arms. She weighed next to nothing. He hauled her to her feet. She flinched, instinctively pulling away. But he held firm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. It was just a statement of fact. "But if you stay out here, you die. My cabin is 50 yards away. Walk." He put her arm over his shoulder, taking most of her weight. She smelled of cold dust and stale sweat. Together, they stumbled out of the barn and into the screaming wind. The inside of the cabin was a furnace compared to the howling void outside. Gideon slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the iron bolt. He practically carried Nora to the chair beside the iron stove. She collapsed into it, folding in on herself, her hands hovering inches from the heated black metal. Gideon didn't say a word. He stripped off his coat, hung his rifle over the mantel, and grabbed a tin pot. He poured the sludge from breakfast into a mug, set it on the hottest part of the stove to boil, and pulled a thick wool blanket from his own bed. He dropped it over her shoulders. "Drink," he ordered when the coffee was steaming. He shoved the tin mug into her hands. She took it, her fingers curling around the hot tin. She winced at the heat, but didn't let go. She took a sip, coughing at the bitter, muddy taste, but swallowed it down. The warmth slowly brought a flush of color back to her cheeks. Gideon sat on a wooden stool across from her. He rolled a cigarette, his fingers moving with practiced, mechanical precision. He struck a match on the heel of his boot, lit it, and inhaled deeply. The smoke filled the space between them. "You're a long way from home, Nora Jane," he said, staring at the glowing cherry of the tobacco. "Chicago," she said softly. Her teeth had stopped chattering. I was a seamstress. Factory shut down. The landlord gave me 3 days to pay back rent or get thrown in the street. I saw an advertisement in the paper. Mr. Trent wrote lovely letters, said he had a sprawling ranch, 200 head of cattle, said he needed a woman to help manage the household. Josiah Trent lived in a sod hut and drank his cattle money away. Before he even bought the herd, Gideon said flatly. You were sold a lie. Nora stared into her coffee. I figured that out about 5 miles into my walk here. She looked up, surveying the cabin. It was sparse, clean, but aggressively empty. A single bed, a table, 2 chairs, no curtains, no rugs. What about you? You have a sprawling ranch? I have 100 acres of hard dirt, 50 head of cattle that are likely freezing to death as we speak, and a banknote that comes due in the spring. He exhaled a plume of smoke. My name is Gideon Hayes, and I live alone. A widower, she noted. Gideon's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? She pointed a trembling finger toward the corner of the room. Tucked away, half covered by a drop cloth, was a spinning wheel. A bachelor doesn't own one of those. And a man with a living wife wouldn't let dust settle on it. Gideon didn't look at the spinning wheel. He felt a sudden sharp spike of irritation. He didn't like people in his house. He didn't like eyes observing his grief. You're observant, he said, his tone cooling. I'm desperate, she corrected. Desperate people notice things. Silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. The fire popped, spitting a spark against the iron grating. Nora finished the coffee, setting the tin mug on the floor. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow, she said, her voice steadying, when the storm breaks. If you can take me to the stagecoach stop in town, I'll be out of your way. Gideon looked at her. To go where? With what money? She swallowed hard. The defiant front slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the sheer, naked terror beneath. I'll figure it out. I can wash clothes. I can scrub floors. In Red Creek? A single woman with no family and no husband? They won't hire you to wash clothes, Nora. The decent women will run you out of town for fear you're eyeing their husbands, and the saloon owners will trap you in a room upstairs. He stated it not with cruelty, but with the brutal realism of a man who knew the frontier. You have no money. You have nowhere to go. Nora's jaw tightened. Then what do you suggest, Mr. Hayes? I walk back into the snow? Gideon stared at her. He looked at the stubborn set of her jaw. He looked at her hands, raw and blistered from walking. She wasn't a fragile thing. She had survived a factory in Chicago, a train ride across the country, a betrayal, and a freezing night in a barn. She had grit. He looked around his empty cabin. The silence of the last 3 years suddenly felt louder than the storm outside. Winter was here. If he broke his leg, he'd starve in this bed. If he caught a fever, he'd die alone. He was losing the war of attrition against this land, because one man couldn't fight it alone. He dropped his cigarette onto the floorboards and ground it out beneath his boot. I need hands, Gideon said. The words tasted strange in his mouth. Nora frowned, confused. You want to hire me? I can't afford to hire you. I don't have the coin to pay a wage. Then what are you saying? Gideon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'm saying, if you live here as a hired girl, the town will talk. The bank manager is a God-fearing hypocrite who won't extend my credit if he thinks I'm living in sin. The ranchers won't help me brand in the spring. Out here, reputation is currency. Nora stared at him, the realization slowly dawning in her eyes. You're out of your mind. Probably, Gideon admitted. But I'm also pragmatic. You need a roof, food, and a name that keeps the wolves in town away. I need someone to mend clothes, keep the fire burning when I'm pulling calves, and help me hold this land together. You don't know me, she said, her voice breathless. I know you didn't give up when you had every reason to, he countered. That's enough for now. Nora clutched the blanket. A marriage, just like that. A partnership, Gideon corrected. A legal piece of paper that binds us to mutual survival. Nothing more. You take the bed. I sleep on a cot by the fire. We work. We survive the winter. Come spring, if we sell the cattle and you want to leave, I'll give you half the profits, and you can buy a ticket to wherever you want. Nora searched his face. She was looking for the trap, for the hidden malice. But Gideon's eyes were just tired. Exhausted, hollow, and unflinchingly honest. Why before dawn, she asked. Reverend Jenkins rides the morning stage out of Red Creek at 6 a.m. He's heading to Denver for the season. If we don't catch him before he boards, we don't have a preacher for 6 months. We ride into town, wake him up, sign the ledger, and we come back before the town wakes up and starts asking questions. Nora looked down at her mud-stained dress. I hardly look like a bride. And I don't look like a prize, Gideon said, standing up. It's 3 a.m. The wind is dying down. I'm going to saddle the horses. He paused at the door, his hand on the iron bolt. He looked back at her. It's your choice, Nora. I won't force you. You can stay by the fire, and tomorrow I'll drop you at the depot. Nora sat still. She looked at the dancing flames through the stove grate. She thought of the cold barn. She thought of the boarding house proprietor's leering eyes. She thought of Chicago and the factory and the sheer, exhausting reality of being a woman alone in a world built for men. She looked up at Gideon Hayes. A stranger, a harsh man in a harsh land, but a man who had pulled her from the freezing dirt and offered her a lifeline disguised as a business deal. Saddle the horses, Nora said. The ride into Red Creek felt less like a wedding procession and more like a funeral march. The wind had dropped, but the temperature had plummeted, turning the mud ruts of the main road into frozen, jagged teeth that bucked the horses with every step. Nora rode pillion, her hands gripping Gideon's coat so hard her knuckles were white against the rough wool. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was looking at the back of his neck, wondering if she was jumping from the frying pan into a fire that would burn colder than the one she'd left. They reached the outskirts of town just as the sky began to bruise into a pale, sickly gray. Red Creek was a cluster of wooden boxes huddled against the vast emptiness of the plains. It smelled of coal smoke and wet manure. Gideon didn't take her to a church. There wasn't one. He pulled the horses up in front of a drafty, unpainted structure near the boarding house, the Reverend's quarters. He dismounted, his boots crunching loudly in the silence, and helped Nora down. Her legs were stiff, trembling from the cold and the tension. Stay close, he muttered. They hammered on the door until a man with a wild halo of gray hair and eyes bleary with sleep cracked it open. Reverend Jenkins looked them over, his gaze sliding from Gideon's grim face to Nora's muddy dress. And he didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough desperate, frost-bitten souls on the frontier to know that curiosity was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ceremony took 4 minutes. There were no flowers, no guests, and no music. Just the low, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. Do you, Gideon Hayes, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The Reverend asked. His voice was raspy, stripped of any holiness by years of dust and bad coffee. I do, Gideon said. It sounded like a grunt. Do you, Nora Jane, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Nora looked at the Reverend, then at Gideon. He was watching her. Not with love, not with lust, but with an open, terrifying vulnerability that said, "If you say no, I have no idea how I'm going to make it through the winter." "I do," she said. The ink was dry on the ledger before the sun had cleared the horizon. When they stepped back outside, the world looked exactly the same. The wind still cut, the horses were still shivering, and they were still two strangers bound by a piece of paper. "We need supplies," Gideon said, turning to the general store. "I don't have any money," Nora reminded him, her voice barely audible. "We're married now," he replied, digging into his pocket and pulling out a small worn pouch of silver coins, his last reserve for the spring seed. "We pool what we have. It's what you do." They bought flour, a slab of salted pork, a bag of coffee, and a new tin of axle grease. As they loaded the pack horse, a few townspeople started to emerge from their houses. A woman in a shawl stared at Nora, her eyes narrowing with a mix of pity and judgment. Nora didn't look away. She stood straight, adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, and swung herself onto the back of the horse. The ride home was quiet. The sun had crested the horizon, a weak, pale yellow disk that offered light but no warmth. They reached the cabin as the first true bite of the morning storm began to lash against the glass. Inside, the fire had died down to embers. Gideon moved with practiced efficiency, throwing kindling on the grate and blowing until the wood caught. He didn't look at her until the flames were leaping again. "The bed is yours," he said, indicating the wooden frame in the corner covered by a heavy quilt. "I'll take the floor. It's not much, but it's dry." Nora stood by the stove, the heat finally beginning to penetrate her boots. She looked at the cabin, her home now, for better or worse. She reached into her pocket, fingering the silver ring Gideon had bought from the store clerk with the last of his change, a thin, cheap band that felt heavy on her finger. "We made a deal, Gideon," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "We did," he agreed. "I'm not a wife in the way you're used to," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not here to be a decoration or a servant. You want help? You'll get it. But don't expect me to disappear into the background." Gideon looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself like a soldier behind enemy lines. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said. "The winter didn't just test them, it tried to break them." The blizzard that hit 3 days after their marriage lasted for a week. It was a white, blinding chaos that turned the world into a seamless void. They didn't speak much. They moved in a delicate, necessary rhythm born of survival. Gideon spent the mornings in the barn, thawing the water troughs and checking the cattle. Nora spent the hours inside, turning a sack of flour and a hunk of salt pork into something resembling sustenance. It wasn't a romance. There were no stolen glances or soft words by candlelight. It was the crushing intimacy of two people trapped in a 10-by-10 space, learning the topography of each other's silence. Nora was a woman who didn't know how to be still. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were raw wood. She mended every tear in Gideon's shirts, her fingers flying with the needle. She even took the drop cloth off the spinning wheel in the corner. She didn't use it, the wool was gone, but she cleaned the dust from the spokes piece by piece until it gleamed. One evening, while the wind screamed against the eaves, Gideon sat at the small table, his hands buried in the thick, coarse hair of a hide he was trying to scrape clean. He looked up and saw Nora standing by the window, staring out at the white wall of snow. "You regret it," he stated. It wasn't a question. Nora turned. Her face was illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. "I regret that I was desperate enough to have no other choice. But I don't regret being here instead of the street." Gideon picked up his scraper. "That's the best I can offer." "It's enough," she said. She walked over to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of him. Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting, accidental touch that sent a jolt of something foreign, something startling, through Gideon's tired frame. He froze. She didn't pull away immediately. She let her hand rest there for a second longer than was necessary before moving to sit on the floor by the fire. That was the turning point. It wasn't a grand gesture or a declaration of love. It was just the moment the ice stopped moving and started to melt. As the weeks dragged on, the work became their language. When the storm finally broke, they worked the barn together. Nora surprised him by being stronger than she looked. She hauled buckets of feed. She held the calves steady while he branded them. And she didn't flinch at the blood or the gore. She was a city girl, but she was built of iron. Gideon, in turn, began to change. He stopped sleeping with his rifle under his head. He started talking to her while he worked, telling her stories of his father, of the drought years, of the weight of the land. He stopped treating the cabin as a place to endure and started treating it as a place to inhabit. One morning, the first sign of spring arrived, a patch of mud appearing where the snow had melted off the roof. Gideon stood on the porch, his lungs filling with air that finally smelled like wet earth instead of frozen nothing. He heard the door creak open behind him. Nora stood there, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her hair wild and windswept. She looked at the patch of mud, then at the barn, then at the sprawling, desolate horizon. "The snow is gone," she said. "It is," Gideon replied. "The deal is up," she reminded him. Her voice was level, but there was a tremor in her hands. She looked at him, her gray eyes searching his face for the man she'd married, the man who was supposed to let her go when the sun returned. Gideon looked at the landscape he'd spent 3 years trying to conquer. It looked different now. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a garden that hadn't been planted yet. He reached out, his hand, rough, calloused, and strong, covering hers. "I don't have the coin to pay you out," he said softly, "and we have a lot of fence to mend before the cattle go to pasture." Nora's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something softer, something like peace. She didn't pull her hand away. "Well," she said, looking out at the horizon, "I suppose I'd better get to work." They stood there for a long time, 2 people who had started as strangers in the dark, watching the sun rise over the hard, beautiful, unforgiving land they had finally, truly begun to call their own. They didn't have much, not money, not comfort, not a future they could guarantee, but they had the only thing that mattered in the territory. They had each other, and they were still standing. Survival on the frontier isn't a fairy tale. It's a brutal daily negotiation with the earth. Gideon and Nora found that the hardest part of the bargain wasn't the cold. It was the slow, terrifying realization that they were no longer alone. If you enjoyed this glimpse into their harsh, beautiful life, please hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates grit, and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the edge of the world.